Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you didn't even think to question what they were asking you to sign? Because that's exactly where I was. I was sitting in a hospital bed. A thin blue blanket over my legs. A plastic bracelet wrapped around my wrist with my name and birthdate printed on it like a barcode. Machines around me hummed quietly, and every few seconds the heart monitor beside my bed let out a soft, steady beep. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. My surgery was scheduled in 1 hour. At 72 years old, hospitals make you feel strangely small. You suddenly become aware of your age in a way you normally ignore. The fluorescent lights feel too bright. The air smells too clean. And every nurse who walks past reminds you that your body isn't as strong as it used to be. My name is Margaret Lawson. Most people call me Maggie. For 40 years I was an elementary school teacher. I spent my life surrounded by noisy classrooms, messy art projects, and children who believed you could fix almost anything with kindness and patience. I retired 12 years ago. My husband Robert passed away 8 years after that. A stroke that came out of nowhere. One minute we were drinking coffee in the kitchen, and the next minute my entire world had changed. Since then, my family became everything to me. Especially my son Daniel. Daniel Lawson is 45. My only child. When he was little, he was the kind of boy who would bring injured birds home and insist we nurse them back to health. He used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I graded my students' spelling tests. I trusted that boy with my whole heart. And that trust followed him into adulthood. Even when life got complicated. Especially when it came to my granddaughter Emma. Emma is 14 now. Quiet. Observant. The kind of child who watches more than she speaks. She has her grandfather's thoughtful eyes and the habit of noticing things other people miss. But on that particular afternoon in the hospital room, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about surgery. 3 days earlier, doctors had discovered a severe gallbladder infection that couldn't be treated with medication anymore. The surgeon, Dr. Victor Ramirez, explained it calmly. We'll remove the gallbladder laparoscopic. It's routine, Mrs. Lawson. But because of the infection, we shouldn't delay. Routine. Doctors love that word. But when you're the one lying in the hospital bed, routine doesn't always feel comforting. It feels uncertain. Which is why I was relieved when Daniel walked through the hospital room door that afternoon. He looked slightly out of breath, like he had rushed through the hallway. Mom, he said, stepping inside. How are you feeling? Like someone who skipped breakfast and is about to lose an organ, I joked weakly. He gave a quick laugh, but it sounded distracted. Then he did something I didn't think twice about at the time. He pulled a thick set of papers out of a folder. Hey, Mom, we just need to sign a few things before they take you in. I didn't question it. Hospitals always have paperwork. Consent forms. Insurance forms. Privacy forms. Liability forms. It seems like every hallway contains another clipboard waiting for your signature. So when Daniel placed the stack of documents on the tray beside my bed, I assumed that's what they were. Just hospital paperwork. But something about him felt rushed. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall. He tapped his finger against the tray. Just sign where the sticky tabs are, he said quickly. They'll come get you soon. I picked up the pen. And that's when Emma stepped quietly into the room behind him. I hadn't even noticed she was there at first. She stood near the window, holding her phone loosely in her hand, but she wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the papers. Specifically the first page. Her eyes moved across it slowly. And her expression changed. At first I thought maybe she was just worried about the surgery. Teenagers don't always know how to hide their emotions. But this was different. She looked alarmed. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy flipping through the pages and pointing to the first signature line. Right here, Mom. I moved the pen closer. And that's when Emma suddenly crossed the room. She reached out and grabbed my hand. Not hard. Just enough to stop the pen. Daniel looked up immediately. Emma, what are you doing? But she didn't answer him. Instead, she slipped something small and folded into my palm. A tiny piece of paper. Then she stepped back again like nothing had happened. Daniel sighed impatiently. Mom, seriously, we don't have time for this. Just sign it. But I had already opened the note. 4 words. Handwritten in shaky blue ink. Grandma, don't sign anything. For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. The monitor continued its steady beep. Footsteps passed in the hallway outside. But inside that room, something had shifted. I slowly lifted my eyes and looked at Emma. She didn't speak. She just nodded once. Then I looked at my son. For the first time since he walked in, I studied his face carefully. He wasn't worried about my surgery. He was watching the papers. Watching the pen. Waiting for my signature. And suddenly, a thought entered my mind that I had never considered before. Why was my 14-year-old granddaughter warning me about something my own son wanted me to sign? I lowered the pen. And instead of signing, I finally did something I should have done from the beginning. I turned the first page toward me. And I started reading. The title at the top made my stomach drop. Because it wasn't a hospital form. Not even close. It was a legal document. And the words printed across the top explained exactly why my son had been in such a hurry. Property transfer authorization. I slowly looked back at Daniel. And for the first time that afternoon, he looked nervous. But what I discovered on the second page would reveal something even worse. Something that explained exactly why Emma had slipped me that note. And once I understood what those papers really meant, I realized my surgery might not be the most dangerous thing happening in that hospital room. What kind of son asks his mother to sign legal documents an hour before surgery? That question didn't hit me immediately. At first, I simply stared at the title on the paper in my hands. Property transfer authorization. The words looked strange sitting there under the harsh hospital lights. They felt completely out of place beside 4 tubes and heart monitors. I blinked and read the title again. Still the same words. Not hospital paperwork. Not surgical consent forms. Legal documents. And my name was printed across the top of the page. Margaret Lawson. Below it was another name. Daniel Lawson. My son. Across the bed, Daniel shifted his weight slightly. Mom, he said quickly, forcing a small laugh. It's just some paperwork we've been meaning to take care of. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I kept reading. The document was dense with legal language. Paragraphs full of phrases that lawyers seem to love: hereby authorized, transfer of partial ownership, financial access rights. But even through the complicated wording, the meaning started to become clear. Very clear. This document wasn't about my medical care. It was about my house. More specifically, it was about transferring partial ownership of my home to Daniel. Immediately, I felt a strange tightness in my chest, not pain, just the uncomfortable weight of realization settling slowly into place. Daniel, I said calmly, what exactly is this? He waved his hand dismissively. Oh, that? It's just something to simplify things if, anything happens. Anything happens. It was a phrase people used around hospitals all the time. But something about the way he said it made my stomach uneasy. I flipped to the second page. And that's when the details started becoming harder to ignore. The document wasn't just about ownership. It granted Daniel immediate legal co-control of the property. Which meant something important. If I signed it, Daniel wouldn't simply inherit the house someday. He would become a co-owner today. He could refinance it. Use it as collateral. Possibly even sell it with the right approvals. And all of that would happen while I was still alive. I slowly lowered the papers and looked at him. Why would we need to do this today? Daniel's smile tightened. Mom, it's just a precaution. Precaution for what? For the surgery, he said quickly. You never know what could happen. I noticed something then. His eyes weren't meeting mine. They kept drifting back to the pen sitting on the tray beside the bed. Waiting. I turned another page. The document continued for several more sections, filled with complicated financial language. But one clause near the bottom caught my attention immediately. It stated that Daniel would gain authorized access to certain financial accounts connected to the property. Accounts I had maintained since my husband Robert died. Savings accounts. Investment accounts. Accounts Daniel had never been involved with. I felt the weight of Emma's note still sitting in my hand. Grandma, don't sign anything. Across the room, Emma stood near the window again, pretending to scroll through her phone. But she wasn't scrolling. She was watching. Watching both of us. Daniel leaned closer to the bed. Mom, seriously, he said, lowering his voice. We don't have time for this. The nurse could walk in any second. His tone had changed. The warmth was gone. Now it sounded impatient. Pressuring. That's when something inside me shifted. Instead of confronting him immediately, I decided to slow everything down. Very slowly. I set the papers back on the tray and sighed. Oh dear, I said, shaking my head lightly. Daniel frowned. What? I forgot my glasses. He blinked. What do you mean? My reading glasses, I said, patting the blanket beside me. I can't read small print without them anymore. That wasn't entirely true. I could read just fine. But I needed time. Daniel ran his hand through his hair. Mom, it's just standard paperwork. Then you won't mind if I read it properly, I replied calmly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room grew thicker. Finally, he forced another smile. Okay, sure. But maybe we should just focus on the signature lines. I didn't answer. Instead, I flipped another page. And that's when I saw something else. A notarization section. Already prepared. Waiting for a signature. Which meant someone had already expected this document to be signed today. Prepared in advance. My fingers tightened slightly around the page. Across the room, Emma shifted her weight nervously. Then Daniel suddenly stepped away from the bed. I'm going to grab a coffee from the hallway machine, he said quickly. Just read through it while I'm gone. Without waiting for my response, he walked out of the room. The door closed softly behind him. For a moment, the only sound left was the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Emma immediately crossed the room. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Grandma. I looked at her. Sweetheart, what is going on? She glanced toward the door, making sure it was closed. Then she said something that made my heart skip. Dad already tried to get you to sign those once. I frowned. What do you mean, once? Emma hesitated. Then she took a slow breath. He brought those papers to the house 2 weeks ago. I stared at her. 2 weeks ago? I thought you read them already, she continued quietly. I didn't, I said slowly. Emma looked down at the documents on the tray. I did. I felt the room tilt slightly. You read them? She nodded. And that's when I realized something was really wrong. I leaned closer. What do you mean wrong? Emma's voice dropped even lower. Grandma, those papers don't just give Dad part of the house. She looked directly at me now. They give him the power to use it. I frowned. Use it how? Emma swallowed. And the answer she gave next would explain exactly why she had slipped me that note. Because 2 weeks earlier, she had overheard something she was never supposed to hear. Something about money, debt, and a plan that involved my house. What could a 14-year-old possibly notice that a grown woman completely missed? That question stayed in my mind as Emma stood beside my hospital bed, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Grandma," she said quietly, glancing at the door again, "Dad tried to get you to sign those papers 2 weeks ago." I felt the words settle slowly in my chest. 2 weeks ago? I tried to remember. The past month had been a blur of doctor appointments, blood tests, and medical scans. My gallbladder infection had made me tired and distracted. It was entirely possible Daniel had mentioned paperwork and I simply pushed it aside. But Emma was watching me carefully now. And I could tell this wasn't something small. "What happened 2 weeks ago?" I asked. Emma pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. Her hands were folded tightly together in her lap, the way people hold them when they're trying to stay calm. "Dad came over after dinner," she said. "You were in the kitchen making tea." I nodded slowly. That sounded familiar. "He had those same papers," she continued. "He said it was something about making things easier for the future." That phrase again. Making things easier. I remembered something faint now. Daniel standing in the living room with a folder, talking about finances and organization. At the time I had been preoccupied with a phone call from the doctor's office. "I told him I'd look at it later," I said. Emma nodded. "You did. But then you forgot." That sounded like me lately. But Emma hadn't forgotten. "I was curious," she admitted. "So after Dad left, I looked at the papers." I blinked. "You read them?" She gave a small shrug. "I like reading things people leave around." That made me smile slightly despite the tension. Emma had always been curious about everything. When she was 10, she dismantled a broken toaster just to see how the wires worked. But curiosity can reveal things adults overlook. "What did you see?" I asked. Emma leaned forward a little. "At first it looked normal," she said. "Just a lot of legal words." That matched what I had just seen myself. But then I noticed something strange. "What?" "The date." I frowned. "The date?" Emma nodded. The document was created the same week Dad had a big argument on the phone. I felt my stomach tighten. "What argument?" Emma hesitated for a moment, as if she were deciding how much to tell me. Then she continued. "I was in my room doing homework," she said. "Dad was downstairs in the kitchen. He didn't know I was listening." She paused. "And he sounded really angry." Emma imitated his tone softly. "You said I had another 6 months." My heart skipped. 6 months for what? I asked. "I don't know," Emma said. "But the person on the phone kept saying something about payments." Payments. Debt. The pieces in my mind started shifting slightly. Emma continued. "Dad said something else too." "What?" She lowered her voice again. "He said, once I get the house paperwork done, we'll settle everything." For a moment, the room felt colder. "Are you sure he said that?" I asked carefully. Emma nodded. "I'm sure." She looked at the stack of documents on the tray beside me. "That's why I read them." I picked up the first page again. Property transfer authorization. When you're young, documents like this feel abstract. Just words on paper. But when you've owned a home for 40 years, those words mean something real. That house wasn't just property. Robert and I bought it when Daniel was 3 years old. I could still picture the day we moved in. The smell of fresh paint. The squeaky wooden stairs. Daniel running through the empty living room pretending it was a castle. Every birthday party. Every Christmas dinner. Every quiet Sunday morning drinking coffee on the porch. All of it happened inside that house. And now this document sitting on a hospital tray was quietly suggesting that someone else might control it. Emma continued speaking. I didn't understand everything in the papers, she admitted. So I searched some of the phrases online. That didn't surprise me. Teenagers look up everything. And? She pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. That part means Dad could refinance the house if you sign. I followed her finger and reread the clause. Authorization for financial leverage and restructuring of property assets. Legal language for something very simple. Borrowing money using the house as collateral. I leaned back against the pillow slowly. Why would he need to do that? Emma's expression darkened slightly. Because he owes money. I looked at her sharply. Owes money to who? She shook her head. I don't know exactly. But he's been getting a lot of calls lately. Debt collectors. Loan officers. Business partners. Emma explained that over the past month Daniel had started taking phone calls late at night. Sometimes he would step outside onto the porch to talk privately. But sound carries in quiet houses. Especially when someone is listening carefully. I heard him say the word foreclosure once, Emma said. My breath caught slightly. Foreclosure. That word didn't belong anywhere near my family. Daniel worked in real estate development. He flipped houses and invested in property projects. It had always seemed like a successful career. But businesses can collapse quietly. Deals fall apart. Investments fail. And sometimes people hide those problems from the people closest to them. Emma looked down at her hands. I didn't know what to do, she said softly. You didn't tell your dad you read the papers? She shook her head quickly. No. Why not? Emma met my eyes. Because the way he was acting scared me. That sentence stayed in the air between us. Across the room, the hallway outside suddenly grew louder as a cart rolled past the door. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Emma added one more thing. When I saw him bring the papers today, I knew he was going to try again. I felt the weight of the pen still sitting beside the documents. Waiting. And suddenly the entire situation looked different. This wasn't paperwork for the future. This was urgency. Desperation. Daniel needed something. Something big. And he needed it before my surgery. Just then the hospital room door opened again. Daniel walked back and holding a cup of coffee. His smile returned instantly when he saw us. All right, he said lightly. The nurse told me we probably have 10 minutes. He set the coffee down and picked up the pen. Then he slid it toward me across the tray. Mom, just sign right there. I looked at the pen. Then the papers. Then my son. And for the first time that afternoon, I made a decision. A very careful decision. I pushed the pen back toward him. Before I sign anything, I said calmly, I'd like someone from the hospital to look at these. Daniel's smile froze. What? A hospital administrator, I continued. His face changed instantly. Panic. Real panic. Mom, that's not necessary. But the way he said it told me something important. It was absolutely necessary. Because whatever was written inside those papers, he clearly didn't want anyone else reading them. And what happened next would reveal exactly why. What happens when someone tries to pressure a patient into signing legal documents inside a hospital? That was the question hanging in the air the moment I pushed the pen back across the tray. Daniel stared at me like I had just said something completely unreasonable. A hospital administrator, he repeated, forcing a laugh. Mom, this is just family paperwork. I kept my voice calm. Then it shouldn't be a problem if someone else reads it. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Emma. Emma was standing near the window again, quiet but alert. She wasn't pretending to scroll on her phone anymore. She was watching him directly. That seemed to make him even more uncomfortable. "Mom," Daniel said, lowering his voice, "the nurses are going to come any minute." "You're overthinking this." Overthinking. That word always appears when someone doesn't want you thinking too much. I folded the papers neatly and set them back on the tray. "Maybe I am," I said. "But I'd feel better if someone looked at them first." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, pacing once across the small hospital room. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. At that exact moment, the door opened and Nurse Linda Park stepped inside. She smiled warmly. "Mrs. Lawson, we'll be getting you ready for surgery soon." Daniel immediately stepped forward. "Actually, nurse, we just need a minute." But I spoke first. "Ms. Park," I said gently, "could you help me with something?" She walked closer to the bed. "Of course." I handed her the papers. "My son asked me to sign these, but I'd like someone from the hospital administration to review them first." The nurse glanced at the first page. And I saw the moment her expression shifted. Subtle. Professional. But noticeable. She flipped to the second page, scanning the legal language quickly. "These aren't hospital forms," she said. "No," I replied quietly. Daniel let out a short laugh. "They're just family documents." Nurse Park didn't argue. But she looked at me carefully. "Mrs. Lawson, would you like me to contact an administrator?" "Yes," I said. Daniel's patience finally cracked. "Mom, seriously." But Nurse Park had already stepped into the hallway. "I'll see who's available," she said. The door closed behind her. And suddenly the room felt very small. Daniel turned toward me slowly. "You didn't have to do that." His voice was tight now. "Yes, I did," I said calmly. Emma stayed silent, but I could feel her watching the entire exchange carefully. Daniel started pacing again. "You're making this into something it's not." "Then it should clear up quickly," I replied. 5 minutes later, the door opened again. A tall man in a gray suit stepped into the room. He looked to be around 60, with neatly combed silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent years dealing with complicated situations. "Mrs. Lawson," he said politely. "My name is George Bennett. I'm the hospital administrator on duty." I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He stepped closer to the bed. Nurse Park handed him the documents. Mr. Bennett began reading. Very slowly. Very carefully. Daniel crossed his arms. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. But the administrator didn't respond right away. Instead, he finished the first page. Then the second. Then the third. By the time he reached the last page, his eyebrows had risen slightly. Finally, he looked up. His eyes moved from Daniel to me. Then back to Daniel. "Mr. Lawson," he said calmly, "why are legal property transfer documents being presented to a patient 1 hour before surgery?" Daniel tried to smile. "It's just family business." Mr. Bennett didn't return the smile. "In a hospital setting," he said evenly, "patients are considered medically vulnerable. That means we strongly discourage them from signing non-medical legal documents." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "She understands what she's signing." Mr. Bennett turned to me. "Mrs. Lawson, have you had time to fully review these documents with a lawyer?" "No," I said. "Were they prepared by your attorney?" "No." He nodded slowly. Then he closed the folder. "Under these circumstances," he said, "I would strongly advise against signing anything today." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Look, this is between me and my mother." Mr. Bennett's tone remained calm but firm. "It became our concern the moment a patient felt pressured." The word pressured hung in the room like a bell that had just been struck. Daniel looked at me. "Mom, are you seriously telling them I pressured you?" For a moment, I felt something inside me ache. Because despite everything happening, this was still my son. The boy who used to run through the yard chasing fireflies. But adulthood changes people. And sometimes not for the better. I looked at him quietly. Daniel, I said, why didn't you ask me about this 2 weeks ago? His expression faltered. What? Emma told me you brought these papers before. His eyes flicked toward her instantly. Emma didn't move. The silence lasted several long seconds. Then Daniel sighed. You don't understand the situation. You're right, I said gently. I don't. Mr. Bennett stepped forward. Mr. Lawson, he said, I think it would be best if we paused this conversation until after your mother's surgery. Daniel opened his mouth to argue. But at that moment 2 nurses entered the room with a gurney. Mrs. Lawson, one of them said kindly, it's time. The moment had arrived. The surgery. I handed the documents back to Daniel. And signed. He stared at them like something valuable had just slipped through his fingers. Then I looked at Emma. She was standing near the foot of the bed, her face pale but steady. I reached out and squeezed her hand. Thank you, I whispered. The nurses began rolling the bed toward the door. As the room slowly moved past me, I saw Daniel standing there with the folder still in his hands. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because the real consequences of those papers wouldn't happen before my surgery. They would happen after. And when Daniel discovered the decision I made during my recovery, it would change our entire family forever. They wheeled me down the long hospital corridor under rows of bright fluorescent lights. Hospitals always feel strange when you're the one on the bed instead of the one walking beside it. The ceiling tiles slide past slowly above you, one after another, while unfamiliar voices echo from distant hallways. A nurse walked beside the bed adjusting my 4-line. Another held the chart at the foot of the gurney. But my eyes stayed fixed on Emma walking quietly beside us. 14 years old. And somehow the only person in the room who had protected me. As the operating room doors came into view, she squeezed my hand. You'll be okay, Grandma. I smiled at her. I know. But as the nurses rolled me through those doors, another thought sat quietly in the back of my mind. Not about the surgery. About my son. About the papers. And about what desperation can make people do. The surgery itself passed in a blur. Anesthesia is a strange thing. One moment the anesthesiologist is asking you to count backwards from 10, and the next moment you wake up hours later feeling like time simply disappeared. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a recovery room. Soft lighting. A dull ache in my side. And a nurse adjusting the monitor beside me. Welcome back, Mrs. Lawson, she said gently. Surgery went very well. Relief washed through me. At 72, even routine procedures carry risks. But the surgery had been successful. The infection was gone. My body just needed time to heal. Over the next 2 days I rested quietly in the hospital. Daniel visited once. He brought flowers. A polite smile. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Neither of us mentioned the papers. He asked how I felt. I told him I was improving. We spoke about small things. Weather. Hospital food. Television programs. But beneath every word was the same silent understanding. The conversation we avoided was the only one that mattered. Emma visited the second day. She sat beside the bed and told me about school. About a science test she had passed. About a teacher who assigned too much homework. Normal things. But before she left, she leaned closer. Grandma, she whispered, are you going to sign those papers later? I looked at her carefully. What do you think I should do? Emma didn't answer right away. Then she said something surprisingly wise for a 14-year-old. I think people shouldn't rush you when they want something important. I smiled softly. You might be right. 3 days later, the doctors discharged me. Daniel offered to drive me home. I accepted. The car ride was quiet. The neighborhood looked exactly the same when we pulled into my driveway. The same maple tree in the front yard. The same white porch railing Robert had installed years ago. But as I stepped back inside the house, I knew something had changed. Not the house. My perspective. The next morning I made a phone call. To someone Daniel didn't expect. My lawyer. His name is Thomas Green. He's 68 years old and has handled my legal matters since Robert passed away. Careful man. Very precise. When I arrived at his office 2 days later, I placed the folder of papers on his desk. I want you to read these, I said. He adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the documents. Just like the hospital administrator had done. Slowly. Carefully. By the time he reached the final page, he leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly, that's concerning. How concerning? I asked. Thomas tapped the document. If you had signed this, Daniel would have gained immediate financial control over several of your assets. Control? I repeated. Yes, he said. Specifically the ability to leverage your home as collateral for loans. Exactly what Emma had suspected. I sat quietly for a moment. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Is there a way to make sure this never becomes a problem again? Thomas folded his hands thoughtfully. There is. And that conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of reviewing financial documents. Property titles. Estate planning. Legal protections. When I finally left his office, several new documents had been prepared. Very different documents from the ones Daniel had brought to the hospital. 2 weeks later Daniel came by the house. He looked more relaxed than he had in the hospital. Maybe he thought time had smoothed things over. Maybe he believed the issue had simply faded away. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where he had done homework as a child. Mom, he said gently, about the hospital, things just got a little tense. Yes, I agreed calmly. They did. He leaned forward slightly. I just want to make sure everything's taken care of moving forward. I nodded slowly. That's exactly what I wanted too. I reached into the drawer beside the table and pulled out a new folder. His eyes immediately locked onto it. I spoke with my lawyer, I said. Daniel's posture straightened. Oh? Yes. I slid the folder across the table toward him. These are the new arrangements. He opened the documents and began reading. At first his expression stayed neutral. Then confusion appeared. Then surprise. Finally, disbelief. Mom, what is this? It's a family trust, I said calmly. The documents explained everything clearly. My house. My savings. My investments. All placed inside a legal trust. Assets protected. Ownership secured. But the most important part appeared on page 3. Daniel flipped to it. And froze. Because the trustee listed there wasn't him. It was Emma. My granddaughter. The one person who had protected me when I needed it most. Daniel looked up slowly. You made Emma the trustee? Yes. He stared at me like he was trying to understand something that no longer made sense. But, she's 14. For now, I said. The trust arrangement included professional oversight until she reached adulthood. Legal protection. Careful management. Everything Thomas Green had recommended. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time since that hospital room, he didn't look angry. He looked stunned. I spoke gently. Daniel, if you ever needed help, you could have asked. He didn't answer. Because sometimes the hardest truth to face is the one you created yourself. Families are supposed to protect each other. But sometimes the person who protects you is the one you least expected. And sometimes the person you trust the most is the one who forces you to learn a very different lesson. So let me ask you something. If you had been in that hospital bed 1 hour before surgery, and someone rushed you to sign papers you hadn't read, would you have signed them? Or would you have listened to the quiet voice warning you to stop? Because sometimes the smallest note can save everything.